raises up and down.
Oh, this? Yeah, that's probably good. I don't know how close you have to be to. Like, do you have to speak into
Oh, yeah.
like that?
There you go.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. I think we'll get started. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Amber Vibetto, and I am the Executive Director of North Dakota CAN. We are a relatively new organization that got started largely in response to the government overreach that happened during the pandemic. One of the silver linings that came out of that time was that it pulled back the curtain on what was actually being taught in public schools and private schools. And the riots during the summer of 2020 gave us a really clear picture of just how radicalized our nation's youth had become, largely due to the Marxist indoctrination that happens in college campuses across this country. One of the biggest lessons of the last few years, and there have been many, is that there is no such thing as a neutral education. Students that go to public schools and secular universities, they are being discipled just like the students that go to Christian schools and Christian universities. The only difference is the worldview being formed in their young minds. The secular progressive worldview, along with lower and lower proficiency scores that have emerged from our public schools and universities over the last several decades, has led us to a country in decline and a culture in chaos. Fortunately, there has been a great awakening, and there is a growing movement among parents and concerned citizens who are reasserting parental authority and involvement in the area of education. This movement will only continue to grow stronger, and the more light we shed on this issue. That is why we are so honored to have our two speakers here tonight to share their experience and their knowledge on how critical social theories have been embedded in public schools and universities. So let's get to it. It's my honor to introduce our first speaker tonight. Frank McCormick is a former public school teacher who exposed critical pedagogy in his district. He is founder of Chalkboard Heresy, a collection of essays, editorials, and stories capturing the pain, frustration, and disillusionment of his time in public education. Please give a warm welcome to Frank McCormick.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out. Hope you find this illuminating. I'm going to talk about my. We lost the signal. We'll get back to it. Well, I'm going to talk about my kind of experience in public education and how that led me to discover certain things and come to certain realizations about what was happening. Fix this. There we go. This is a partly personal and political story because it was happening to me and I was going through it in kind of a greater political context. I taught history for 12 years at a school called Waukegan High School. And you probably don't know what Waukegan High School is. It's a school in northern Illinois, one of the biggest high schools, also one of the worst high schools. And you could see some of these headlines, things we dealt with, stabbings in the classroom. This was very recently. A teacher beat a student up during a fight that broke out in class. I was an AFT union member, so I was very much part of the system. But I had a lot of doubts for a long time, and in 2021, I decided to kind of publicly defect. And a lot of that came from seeing what was happening in the news cycle and parents who were concerned about what was being taught in school, but were being told that it's not happening. You're crazy. You've never been in a classroom. You haven't taught, so you don't really know what it's like. And I thought to myself, wait a second, but I'm seeing these things that these parents are talking about, and they are right. Teachers are just scared to come out and say it. And so I felt that there needed to be some validation, and that kind of led me to make some decisions that made the end of my career a very interesting ride. I'll talk about kind of the early years. I wasn't always conservative. I kind of went into education, and I think this is important to understand, like many teachers do. You get kind of ideologically indoctrinated into certain beliefs about your role as an educator in social salvation and social justice. And so I came into public education very much with this naive missionary purpose. The realities of what I saw, however, made me question a lot. And the system and the dysfunctionality in the system made me very rapidly lose faith in it. And this led to kind of like a crisis of faith where I was like, well, you know, if schools aren't these social salvation centers and seeing certain leftist policies fail in education, you know, I'm like, what if everything I believed and been taught wasn't true? However, what I learned in public education very early on, and sometimes people don't understand this about, they're like, why don't more teachers speak out? Why don't more teachers, you know, get on the side of parents, is to survive in the system, you kind of have to undergo an indoctrination. The system is very good at correcting behavior it doesn't like, at threatening you with your job, at social ostracization. So you learn to survive in public education as a teacher, even if you start to disagree with it, even if you have questions, even if you see things that are happening that are wrong, that you want to speak out, you learn there's a cost associated with that, a very, you know, harsh penalty. And so what most teachers do is they just go along with things. Now, there are the true believers, but, you know, there are also conservative teachers. They just keep quiet. They don't want to say anything. They don't want to stir up any trouble. So that was kind of what I had learned to do for a certain period, survive. And I wasn't happy doing it, but, you know, I had a family, and I'm like, I can't lose my job. I can't, you know, keep pushing back. I'm just one person. But things started to change. And in 2016, that was when I first noticed things changing in public education. The election of Donald Trump, I remember the day after, teachers were like invigorated with this like revolutionary spirit. We have to do something. We have to make education explicitly political. We can't try to be neutral anymore, or we're going to raise a generation of Donald Trump voters, so we got to put a stop to this. And I remember in particular, one teacher, you know, was putting these posters all around the school, and there were Black Lives Matter posters going around the school, and in every classroom it seemed teachers were talking about what a terrible thing had happened, and we'll be here to support you. But this was coming very much organically from teachers. It hadn't reached an institutional level yet. The school district was staying kind of quiet on things. And so 2016 was when I started to notice teachers really, I mean, they'd always had a political bias. They'd always been left-leaning liberal. But they really saw it now as their calling to do something, to make sure that there was never a Donald Trump again. And the way they figured they would do that is to make students know that it was wrong to vote that way and teach them the right way to vote. Now, 2020 is another big moment, but I want to kind of talk a little bit about what happened before 2020. I started to observe wokeness go mainstream. You know, some people will point to like 2013, 2014 is when they started to notice it. And I think definitely. And then in 2016, 2017, it really starts to pick up steam. And people ask, what does it mean to be woke? To be woke is just to kind of have this critical consciousness, to come to a realization about the perceived injustices and power structures in our world. Meaning understanding that it's kind of a neo-Marxist worldview, looking at society in terms of the oppressed and the oppressors, in every facet of society, though. Whereas Marx looked at it economically in terms of, you know, the working class and then the capitalists, they see now systems of oppression in every part of society. And these power structures according to the woke, must be dismantled by whatever means necessary. Now, a lot of times they won't come out and say, they won't say revolution, they'll say, societal reordering. But what they're talking about is usually revolution. And as I noticed it go mainstream, I also noticed teachers, too, started to really embrace the idea of being woke, especially after the election of Donald Trump. And I had a friend, for example. She was very apolitical, and she was somewhat conservative-leaning. And this was probably about 2017. She transfers to a new school. She was a teacher, and she undergoes DEI training. And they had these sort of like struggle sessions where she was, confessed her racism. She was biracial, so she had to confess her racism, but also how racism affected her. And we spoke, and she talked about how she'd been awakened, how she'd been changed, how she saw the world clearly now, and how she understood oppression and how patriarchy and white supremacy affect every aspect of her life. And I was like, who are you? What happened to you? I think I actually said to her, I said, it sounds like you've been brainwashed by a cult. Half joking, half serious. And she took great offense to that. Like, no, I haven't. I've learned the truth. You need to be exposed to the truth too. And that's when I realized that something bigger was going on. Why was wokeness as almost as a religion going more mainstream? This is just my kind of theory, I guess, as a historian, social scientist. But I started to look at how religion has been declining in America, not just church attendance, but religious beliefs. There's a lot more atheists, especially among young people. And why do I think that's significant? Well, when you look at what kind of wokeness offers people, it offers them purpose, meaning in their life. And so for many people who were not religious, especially young people, they had this void that was kind of left in their lives. They were unfulfilled. And this isn't an argument really like for or against religion. It's just saying functionally religion serves purpose in giving people meaning and identity and structure. And without that, wokeness comes along and it fits really nicely into a set of, the kind of religious module or religious tendencies we have in our brain. Because humans are kind of hardwired to gravitate towards religion, which is why all across the world there are different religions, because that's people's natural proclivity. And I started thinking about wokeism as a religion, historically in a few senses. The word becoming woke, awakened, has very specific religious connotations. It reminded me historically, America's had several great awakenings, kind of religious revivals, where people use that, we've awakened to new religious truth. Now that was Christianity, and wokeness is different in the sense that it's a secular religion. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have all the other elements of religion. It's secular, but it's also puritanical in a sense. It's very obsessed with purity, thinking the right things, saying the right things, having the right beliefs, being ideologically pure. I noticed among teachers that they carried this idea of original sin. So I think that in some ways wokeness is uniquely American in that it borrows certain elements of Christianity and kind of transforms them. For the woke, original sin is whiteness, or being, what they call cisgender or heterosexual. Those are all sins that people inherit. And that's why they have such an emphasis on acknowledging, I acknowledge my whiteness, I acknowledge my privilege, I acknowledge this original sin, and I must be absolved of it. I must confess it. There were also elements I noticed of it as a martyrdom cult, where wokeness seems to constantly look for martyrs for their cause. Michael Brown, George Floyd became really the most well-known one. Social self-flagellation. If you remember historically, In the medieval ages, especially during the plague, you had these people called flagellants. And for their sins, they would go around and punish themselves by whipping themselves on the back. And I noticed with people that were woke, they would often kind of flagellate themselves socially by talking about, oh, I'm privileged and this is so terrible about me and I feel so much guilt. And so I found that kind of interesting. Sacred spaces and places, this idea of having safe places. Schools especially started to get in this. We need to have safe spaces for our students that are affirming and positive. Even the site of George Floyd's death is kind of like a holy site now. There's acts of reverence, kneeling, washing of the feet, which we saw during those riots. And what I came to the conclusion of is, as I saw teachers really buy into this religion of wokeness, they started to become the transmitters of this faith. They started to act as priests. And they saw it as their role to proselytize amongst their students. They've been awakened to these great truths, these great injustices, but their students haven't. And they're at an age when they need to know. So that's why when I started this blog, before I spoke out, Chalkboard Heresy, I kind of said I'm going to be kind of looked at as a heretic because I'm kind of breaking this religious role that I'm supposed to have as a transmitter of wokeness to students. Now, that's kind of the background. You got wokeness is really kind of building up. And all it needed was the right catalyst, something to really set it in motion and to awaken the faith amongst even more people and get some of its material goals and objectives realized across society. And in 2020 with George Floyd, it was the perfect catalyst. They had a martyr now, and they seized upon it very quickly. And for those of you that remember, and I'll talk about what happened in school, because I saw the kind of mass conversion in school right after 2020, but it was all of society. People were very quickly becoming, wanted to be woke, and wanted to participate in this new faith. You saw people in crowds kneeling and crying and undergoing kind of a mass conversion. And it became a much more mainstream faith than it had ever been. So the riots were one thing that really concerned me. When I kind of look back at my story, I remember watching the riots and saying, okay, this isn't just about George Floyd, like he's the catalyst. The riots had a message to them. And a lot of what I saw, as you all did as well, was talk of revolution. It wasn't just about like police reform. You had people talking, revolution, revolution, we need revolution. Communist flags, statues being toppled. So there was this revolutionary spirit that kind of used the George Floyd's death to call people to action. And that concerned me, but at the time I was like, well, these are mostly college students, so there's still, parents can still protect their kids before they get to school to some degree. Before they get to college, they can try and prepare them for some of the indoctrination that they may experience there. But what concerned me was what was going on in my school. Like, why were college students embracing radicalism and calling for revolution? Well, we've known that most colleges, not all, but most have been left-wing and had a radicalizing effect on young people for a long time. And that's not good, but as I said, parents still had time to prepare their kids for that. They could still instill some values. But hold on to this thought about radicalization through higher education. Because when I start to talk about what I saw going on at the K-12 level, I want you to think about what effect that may have on society when it's not just at college, when it starts at a younger age. And that was a big part of what motivated me to say something, because I, as a historian, started to think about where this could take us and where it has historically. So how were K-12 schools responding? And I'm going to show you some examples from my school, because sometimes people say, oh, what exactly happened? What I witnessed happened very rapidly, and it was as if people in the school had been ready for this moment, like they knew what they wanted. They just didn't know how to implement it or how to get public support. Well, now they did. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, was very rapidly institutionalized and advanced. And I said wokeness kind of became the faith of the school. Became, like in my school district, it kind of became the orthodoxy. And they weren't hiding it anymore. So it wasn't just teachers bringing their biases into classrooms. Now it was the official mandate from the district. And that, in turn, emboldened many teachers. And so I watched it unfold. Okay, this was in 1 year. This was a school district that did not have much money. They told us, we can't afford books, we can't afford printing paper. All of a sudden, they find $500,000 to start instituting all these different programs, and a lot of them were focused on training teachers. Get teachers on board so then teachers can bring it to the students, because that was the ultimate goal, was to influence and affect students, to have students go woke, to have them develop critical consciousness. Got to get the teachers that didn't get it in their education colleges, we'll make sure they get it through district trainings. And they had this plan to transform the district. They always use this word, we're going to transform the district. We're going to make it an anti-racist institution. It's going to become an equitable, progressive institution. And they had how they were going to do it each year. Provide professional development topics. Establish an equity policy. Have a leadership team. An equity advisory council. They were going to start to monitor the curriculums, the books. They were going to have ideological control over every facet of the school. Have a place for teachers to report incidents of bias or students to report it. And things began to really rapidly change. Okay? What are some examples? One of the first things that this happened very quickly after George Floyd, and I'd never seen anything like this, so it was very startling for me and other teachers. They went around and confiscated certain Dr. Seuss books. This was the head of the new Equity and Inclusion Department, and she said, if you're using these Dr. Seuss books in your classroom, they're not to be there anymore, you're not to use them, and we're also going and taking them from the library. Now, I'm a history teacher, and I responded to her. I said, okay, I was trying to be reasonable. I said, you're taking these books. What are you going to do with them? I said, can I use them in my history class? Because, this is high school history. We can at least have a discussion. If there's anything, problematic images, we should still be able to talk about this, and kids should still be able to see it. Absolutely not. And they became very concerned that I even asked that question. Why would you ask that? Why would you want these racist books even in your classroom? They should disappear. They don't even have a historical value. Then came the name changes. They started to rename schools across the district. Thomas Jefferson Middle School, no more, because of his ties to slavery, and because of certain allegations which haven't been substantiated, I won't get into. And this was all done with very little community input. It was decided by a council, we're doing it, it's happening. So now I'm okay, they're going through, they're taking Dr. Seuss books, school names are changing. This is weird. This isn't normal. And I started to do some digging. I started to, under a fake email account, I wanted to submit Freedom of Information Act requests to my district to find out what else was going on behind the scenes. Found out they were planning racial affinity groups, which are really segregated groups. They were going to have a black parent network. Now, before this, they had no parental support groups. And the first one they create is for one specific group. And they really, I remember asking about this, and they gaslight. They said, well, anyone can come. I said, okay, well, why not just call it a parental support group? Well, we need to target the most marginalized and oppressed. I said, well, how do you know they are? You're making that assumption. Oh, the data supports it. So you start to see things like this. Then what was really interesting was when I got my hands on their emails through the FOIA process. And they're having conversations about disrupting the so-called past practices of white dominant culture. Remember critical race theory? That thing that was like, it was not happening, it was something conservatives were, it was a fantasy, they're completely delusional. Well, guess what? They're talking about it. They're asking teachers in these equity councils to review critical race theory, to find out what it is, how to apply it. So here I am in the midst of this national debate about CRT, and parents have concerns, and other people outside of education are talking about it. What's the media doing? What are politicians doing? They're saying, oh, you're crazy. It's not anywhere in schools. And here it was. And even when I showed this to people, colleagues, like, oh, that's nothing. It was like just complete denial. I'd never seen anything like it. Sent it to newspapers. Look what I found. You're covering critical race theory in schools, this debate. They're asking teachers to learn about it and apply it. They didn't want to cover it. Started to see more conversations. Anti-racist grading practices. We know that not everyone feels ready to lead conversations with students or staff about domestic terrorism, hate groups, and how white supremacy operates. I mean, this is what was happening. And this was all in these emails are all from a 6 to 7 week period. Very rapidly, things changed. Like I said, like a religious conversion. This right here, white, they started to count and track how many white teachers were in the district. Because part of their plan to, quote unquote, diversify the district, well, we have to know how many non-diverse teachers there are, i.e. white teachers. And they responded to this saying, well, we just wanted to know. We don't plan to do anything. It's like, okay, well, how are you going to diversify the district without pushing certain people out and bringing certain people in? Why would you be counting this? They didn't have an answer. And then the training they were going to. This was the National Equity Project, which you need to keep an eye out for if they're operating in your district. They had something called the end-of-year youth takeover. And you can see Black Panthers with guns, revolutionaries. And our school district and other school districts that were involved were supposed to bring students to this with teachers to find out how to bring about liberation through education. In other words, revolution. And after this introductory slide, they began with a native land acknowledgement, where it was kind of like an opening prayer. So we acknowledge we're on native land. And they greeted everyone as comrades. And this was all happening, and it was like no one knew about it. No one knew about it. The media wasn't covering it, but it was real. And then what really concerned me was in the classroom. I said, okay, so this stuff is happening at a district level. It's being institutionalized across the district. But my concern was are students being radicalized? Because with 2020 fresh in my mind, I was like, if students are being radicalized, we're going to have a big problem. So I started to look through the shared Google Drive, and there wasn't a lot there. It was, most teachers use their own personal drives, but some teachers did use it. And I started to look at the lessons that were being taught, and it was amazing how quickly things had changed instructionally in the classroom. No one had any idea. Parents didn't know, other teachers didn't know. Asking questions like, how does the history of apartheid in South Africa in the 80s connect to America today? Didn't ask, did it? Is there a connection? Is there a relation? How is? So it always, one thing I point out, and you'll see some more of these lessons, is they always presuppose things for the students. They've made the argument for the students have to support it. This was from a health class. What is rape culture? So teaching students that society is inherently oppressive, that they're victims, that there's bad people out there keeping them down. This was another student activity where the students were reading this. White violence and choice is always incidental, never fundamental. So teaching, and this was a mostly minority school I taught, so it became even more concerning that, mostly black and Hispanic students were learning that violence is fundamental to white people. A student wrote this at the bottom. This was part of an assignment. I had to blank out the name. Why don't they teach students real history? And I thought to myself, I'm like, that's not her thought. That's what the teachers' union had been saying. We're just trying to teach real history. So kids were picking up on this indoctrination in school and parroting it out. And I started to have students come to me, students who never thought or talked about this before. Why do you have white privilege, Mr. McCormick? Why is it you could murder someone and get away with it? What do you mean? Well, yeah, that's just what we've heard. Like, you have all this power and you get everything. Like, why is that? And I was noticing it was changing students' perceptions of the world and themselves in really negative ways and fostering a lot of anger. Health class now had a social justice unit in it. Systemic racism became conversations in classrooms. So it's from a teacher's lesson, an English teacher, white privilege and the effect it has on minorities. And you imagine, minority kids sitting in class with mostly white teachers telling them this stuff. How does that affect their worldview? And it may not be an immediate problem, but as I started to think about, go back to 2020, you bake this stuff into society. What happens when there's another catalyst and you have generations that have been raised into this idea that they're oppressed by certain groups, enemy classes? It doesn't play out well. Police became the enemy too. Started to have lessons this was from a black history class. Students will be able to, this was the teacher's objective from her lesson plan, explain the relationship between slave patrols, policing, and the school-to-prison pipeline. So right after, in the midst of George Floyd, teaching students that the police are like modern-day slave patrols. So this was clearly problematic. This was one of my favorite ones. This was from another English class. And they were talking about social structures and systems. And the example the teacher used, the prison industrial complex is a system designed to keep white people in power and to keep people of color serving as a source of underpaid labor. I mean, you can't imagine what that does to a kid who's taught that in America, the prison system is basically modern-day slavery, that they can still be a slave. I watch as young students become increasingly politicized and radicalized. This was another student's example. I cannot believe that although we support America, white people still terrorize black people. That's what a 11th grade student wrote. That was what she got out of her class. What starts to happen when millions of students start to think like that? What does that do to our society, to the social stability? What happens when there's another George Floyd? My district was not an anomaly. It was happening everywhere. If anything, it was happening worse in other school districts that I started looking into, that I started hearing about from other teachers. Chicago Public Schools did the same thing. An Office of Equity started instituting, as did my district, which I'll talk about in a minute, something called liberatory design. Abolitionist approach to social and emotional learning. This is the result of the ideological capture of teachers' colleges. So you have to take this one level up. Why were teachers so inclined to adopt this new kind of woke faith? Why were administrators making these sweeping changes? Why was no one resisting or asking questions? Well, because teachers' colleges have been captured for a long time now. And so what's happening is the kind of indoctrination going on at teachers' colleges is coming into the school system. And, you know, it's especially the young new teachers and the young new administrators. They're the ones that have really, you can really see the difference from some of the older teachers. This is some of what you see at teachers' colleges. They talk about a teaching revolution, liberatory education, which I'll get back to, College of Education, radically loving liberation and restorative pedagogies of black minds, schooling young children from a feminist pedagogy to liberatory learning. So we have a real problem with our teachers' colleges because, you know, where are we hiring our teachers from? Well, they've all been through this system, and this is what they're getting. And this is what they bring to students. Education is liberation, the role of the teacher in the work of liberation. So what is that? What does that mean? I don't know if you've seen it in your own schools. You might want to look, but this is something I start to notice, liberatory education. They talked about liberatory education. And what I saw this really as is kind of the weaponization of teaching. The idea of it was that they were going to help students. The teacher's job was now a political one, to help students see the oppressive power structures in their lives and to make future change agents. Has anyone ever heard that word used in their school, change agents? It's very popular if you start to, like, if you maybe read district documents, a lot of times they'll talk about being agents of change agents, really revolutionaries. And these change agents, they're supposed to help make students change agents, are supposed to help bring about a reordering of the existing social order to dismantle oppression. So this is their goal. We get students to become woke, to awaken to these systemic inequalities, to structural oppression, and we help them analyze it, become change agents, so they can create the world that we want. And it's really smart. In some ways, like, they've kind of given up on adults. Like, adults are a lost cause. We don't want to spend our time arguing with adults, trying to change their thinking, get them to go along with us. But if we start with students when they're young, that's where it is. And the more I dug, the more a pattern emerged. Initially, as I was going through this, I'm like, am I crazy? Like, is this, like, this can't be happening. Maybe it's just a coincidence at my school district. I saw this was from a gun violence protest. This was an elementary student. She had her hand up in the air. And I started to ask myself, is this spontaneous? Like what 9-year-old girl just goes out of school, like, and does that fist in the air, which has a certain symbolism. And all the kids were going out, and the schools just let them. And I'm a teacher, so I'm like, this doesn't just happen. Kids just don't walk out of school spontaneously, especially elementary kids, and say, hey, we're having a political protest. This is organized, because nothing happens at schools without them wanting it to. Kids don't just walk out of the building. And that symbolism she's using is learned. And sometimes people don't like to use the word indoctrination because they're like, oh, it makes me sound, crazy, like they're indoctrinating kids. But learned political instruction is indoctrination. When you're instructed to partake in political events, use political symbols, think in certain ways, that's indoctrination. And I started to notice these patterns. Pedagogy of the oppressed, that fist. This is I don't have time to talk about it, but it's kind of become a key book in teachers' education. This idea of liberation through education as teaching as a political act. And then I noticed it's not just in colleges, it's teachers. Richmond Teachers for Social Justice. You see this at teacher strikes. Advancing racial literacies in teacher education. Planning to change the world. And then for students, starts to become pedagogy and curriculum. It's giving them what they call an anti-racist education. And then you see it in adults, what's been learned. Because children that are indoctrinated at a young age will very likely grow up into indoctrinated adults. So I looked at this, I'm like, how much of a coincidence can this be? It's just chance that kids are using it, teachers are using it, teachers' colleges, books are using it, curriculums, riots, DEI departments. And believe me, I wish it was a conspiracy. I wish I was crazy. But unfortunately, it's what's happening. And if you start to dig in certain schools, you look through your own school, use the Freedom of Information Act, find out what's happening, you may be very surprised. I've called this phenomenon, to kind of bring it full circle, trickle-down radicalization, where you have this kind of ideology that has a very blood-soaked history. Now it's kind of neo-Marxist, but historically, these ideas have been responsible for terrible revolutions, terrible governments, terrible things happening. From China's Cultural Revolution to the Russian Revolution. And we know it got into universities. I mean, that's something that we've known for a long time. We saw it in the 60s and 70s. Universities were very left-wing and radical. But then it started to really trickle into education departments. And I think that was purposeful. Because the teachers that go through those education departments in college and new administrators bring it to schools. And the radicalization happening in schools comes to children. And it's easy with a little, historians call this the historical imagination. Use what we know about history to kind of imagine how things may turn out, to project a little. Kids that are radicalized, those kids that I showed you were writing things about like how they saw themselves in the world and oppression and being hated by white people and the need for revolution. Well, what kind of adults does that make? It makes them critically conscious, seeing oppression everywhere. Identitarians, very concerned with this concept of identity, of whiteness, of blackness. And that gets baked in, and they have an enemy. The system, capitalism, white supremacy. And when you have a spark, another catalyst, another 2020 type incident with another George Floyd, think about when it's not just mostly college kids, when you have a generation or two that has been taught this stuff. What will the riots look like then? Will it be controllable? Will it die down? Historically, what happens is when young people are radicalized enough, and you do have some type of spark, and the conditions are right, people usually end up with tyranny. They either riot and revolt their way into it, or they vote their way into it. And that was my big fear, kind of putting it all together. Now, people have said to me, sometimes they'll see this and they'll say, oh, come on. When have students or young people ever done this? When have they ever been agents of political change? When have they ever been targeted for political purposes? My answer as a historian is, all the time. I mean, it's really the rule rather than the exception. Ideologues know that kids make the perfect targets. They're young, they're vulnerable. Why waste your time trying to get adults on board when you can start young enough? Whether it was Germany or Russia or Cuba or China. And I have a friend who grew up during the Cultural Revolution. She was a student, and she really encouraged me to say something, because as I would talk to her about this on the phone, I would say, Lily, I'd say, I feel like I'm crazy saying this. I feel like it just sounds nuts. And she would say, Frank, this is exactly what happened in China. This is what happened to me. She said, we had a very political education. Young people became very politicized and radicalized, and they eventually led the revolution, the Cultural Revolution, student-led. So my hope is that having an understanding that not that this is guaranteed to happen, but that it's a possibility, and it has happened throughout history, that we might be able to do something before it's too late. But we have to act soon. The longer you wait, the more generations, the more kids go through this in school. And the schools are not slowing down. They're not stopping. A lot of people like to think, because parents have stood up like, hey, maybe things are getting better. They're at least a little more aware of it. If anything, what I've observed is schools are doubling down on this. I mean, we said, a year ago, no to critical race theory in education. And it's a year later, they're bringing drag queens into schools and all sorts of, sexually explicit books. It's that does not tell me that schools have been very receptive to what parents have been saying. It's almost like a challenge. Yeah, we're going to do this, and what are you going to do about it? Is it affecting kids? You can even see there has been a generational shift. This right here, says, government should solve our problems. And you can see a big generational gap. And when they do surveys of young people and their political views, they're changing. This is having an effect on kids, how they think. They're becoming more woke, more radicalized. The surveys are alarming. They survey, is violence ever justifiable when you don't like what someone is saying? Records of numbers of young people are saying, yes, it is. Records of numbers of young people have favorable views of communism and socialism, and legitimizing the use of violence against speech they don't like, which is really concerning. And I really feel like our republic rests upon what's going on in our schools. If we don't get control back, if this keeps happening, the fracture in education is going to fracture the whole country. It has to be the most important political issue, regardless of what other political issues that are really important to you. And not to say they're not important, but none of that will matter if you don't have voters on your side. I mean, if you really care about the Second Amendment or, religious freedom, well, if more and more young people are being indoctrinated into certain views, you might never win an election again. And I think the left knows this. They're playing a very long and strategic game that'll play out very well for them. And if we don't get control back of our schools, it's going to end poorly for us. So what can we do? A lot of times people will ask me, I'll say, oh, that's very depressing. What can we do? And it's concerning. I understand it's not a nice thing to talk about. But there are things I think we can do and move in the right direction. I don't have all the answers. But what you have to do is you have to first kind of know what you're dealing with. Educate yourself on the ideology and its language. Like James Lindsay's who's selling the book Cynical Theories really helped me understand what I was seeing going on in my school district. Helped me identify it. Once I identified it, I knew how to fight it. Educate others. Talk to them about what's going on. Show them the proof. Organize at the grassroots level. And start to look at your school districts. Organize parent networks. Use the Freedom of Information Act to find out what is happening. The FOIA is very powerful. You can get email records. You can ask them to search by keyword. And you can use that, like search any email that talks about white supremacy or equity, and they'll have to return it to you. And then you've got a starting point. School board elections have to be taken very seriously. They're probably some of the most important elections in our lifetime because they determine what goes on in our schools and what our young people will learn. I think there has to be an effort to support dissenting teachers. We need more teachers to come out and show what's going on because it's so hard to find out what's going on in schools. They make it so difficult. And there are teachers out there who want to say, hey, they send me messages all the time. Can you share this for me? This is going on in my school. I just don't want to lose my job. We have to find a way to get them comfortable speaking out. And really, again, make education the number one issue of our time. For the Republican Party, it should be like the number one issue for the next decade. If you care about having the votes to win on all the other issues, you need to make sure that our schools are not working against us in that regard. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to listen. After James speaks, I'll be able to take any questions you may have, so if you've got some questions, hold on to those, please. But thank you for listening, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Frank. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. An American-born author, mathematician, and political commentator, Dr. James Lindsay has written 6 books spanning a range of subjects, including religion, the philosophy of science, and postmodern theory. Dr. Lindsay is the founder of New Discourses, an organization dedicated to shining the light of objective truth in subjective darkness. Dr. Lindsay is the co-author of Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody, and is the author of his new book, Race Marxism. Dr. Lindsay has been featured guest on Fox News, Glenn Beck, Joe Rogan, and NPR. Please give a warm welcome to James Lindsay.
Hey y'all, thanks for coming out. Thank you for the warm welcome to North Dakota. It makes up for the weather. I don't know if you noticed, it's cold out. It's a little new for my southern bones to deal with. But no, it's been a very warm welcome. I'm very glad to be here to talk to North Dakota. The first thing I want to tell you guys, I'm going to add, Frank set me up perfectly. We didn't coordinate, I promise. And I'm going to talk to you guys about a lot of kind of very scary things also. But I really want to impress upon you that this is happening in North Dakota, a strategy that the left has been using, and I hear this, I travel all around. This is the 41st state that I've had the privilege of coming to visit to speak to, and I go to red state after red state. They brag, ruby red Idaho, the gemstone state. Oklahoma competes and says they're the reddest state in the country. Utah says that they're super conservative with their governor, Spencer Cox, he, him, who used his pronouns on television. All the rhinos should be using their pronouns. So anyway, I hear this, and I see this is happening in every single one of those states. The left realizes that people think it's probably not happening in North Dakota. This is ruby red. It's probably not happening in my state of Tennessee. I'll tell you, we had a drag queen performance at my county courthouse a couple of months ago. It is. It's happening rampantly throughout Texas. It's tearing apart Oklahoma. The University of Oklahoma is the epicenter of the DEI industry. A great number of the concepts of so-called whiteness were invented at the University of Oklahoma. A great many of the concepts were invented in the Indiana university systems and at Purdue. Idaho is being torn apart. Utah is naming itself the cradle of the fourth industrial revolution and partnering with the World Economic Forum to make that happen. This is happening across red America too. You have to take advantage of the fact that you're in a state, unlike my friend Frank, who's in Illinois, that can really do something about this very, very effectively, much more easily if they're willing to step up. But it requires not just taking for granted that, oh, well, we're going to get a Republican in office, whoever's on the ticket's going to win, it's going to be okay. That's not how this works. We're in the midst of a cultural revolution. I think Frank actually made that very clear. There are about 1 million places that I feel like I could start to kind of jump off of what he said into the remarks that I'm kind of hoping to shape as I go and to give. And I think that maybe one of the better places to start is with actually that trickle-down radicalization that he nearly closed with. And as a matter of fact, I had intended, that was one of the 3 or 4 possible ways I thought I would start off with you. And this is happening, by the way, I'll also just mention, we're not going to go down the rabbit hole, but this is happening in your churches by the exact same model. But instead of giving 8 pieces, which Frank did a wonderful job of explaining, I've been saying it in 3. Frank's is a bit more thorough. But it's very simple that there has been a dedicated plan on the left since the 1970s, at least. This is not ambiguous. This is explicit in their literature. It's explicit in their history that they're already writing. There's been an explicit plan since the 1970s on the left to capture colleges of education, because they know if you capture the colleges of education, then you capture the teachers, and if you capture the teachers, then you capture the students. And if you capture the students, you capture the future. And they've understood this for 50 years, or longer, but certainly for 50 years, unambiguously. And they've implemented this plan intentionally for those 50 years, unambiguously. In fact, they brag about it. Just to put it in terms of the churches, the same model works there. If you capture the seminaries, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville or whatever, you capture the seminaries, you capture the pastors. If you capture the pastors, you capture the laity, you capture the soul of the people. As a matter of fact, one very famous pastor, you can look him up, his name is Rick Warren. Some people call him America's pastor. You can look up his speeches at the World Economic Forum meetings in Davos, where he explained explicitly that getting religion on board with their program would be the 3rd leg of the stool that holds it up. And getting the faiths on board would be the 3rd leg of the stool that holds it up. And the mechanism is the same. Capture the teaching colleges or seminaries, capture the teachers or the pastors, capture the children and the laity, transform the future. So this is something that's happening, and this is how it's happening, and this is what has to be dealt with. The colleges of education are completely corrupt. They're completely lost. Frank showed a slide with a book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, with a fist on it. Lots of books with fists on it. How all these people have been using fists and nobody's realized that it's a communist symbol, I'm kind of confused about. except that I realize, and Frank as a historian could back me up, is that we have not had what we've been accused of having. We've been accused of teaching whitewashed history in this country, but we have been teaching for 50 years red-washed history. The history of communism has been washed out of our education system. Our children, I, as a child, 35 years ago, did not learn about communism. I often do this in audiences. I ask them, how many of y'all can name, how many of you know what the Holodomor was? Anybody know what the Holodomor was? Anybody? Raise your hand if you know. One? That's usually what I get. Two or three sometimes. The Holodomor was when the Soviets starved the Ukrainians, possibly 3 or 4 million of them. It was a genocide at least half the scale of what the Nazis perpetrated, and you've never heard of it because we have red-washed education. How many of you have heard the Chinese phrase, suzhou? Nobody. It means 4 olds. Have you heard it by its English translation? Or 4 obsoletes, 4 old things. What that means, that's what Mao Zedong named. That's what Mao Zedong named for the student revolutionaries, the Red Guard. That's the name of this event, creating a new Red Guard. That's what he said was the target, the 4 olds. The 4 olds had to be destroyed. The students, the young people, had to destroy the old things, old culture, old customs, old habits, old ways of thinking. 4 olds. Very vague, abstract things. But culture, in German, the original German, destroy the culture, was called Aufheben der Kultur. That's what the critical Marxists and cultural Marxists called their program to take over Western nations. It means abolish the culture. Aufheben der Kultur. Destroy the 4 olds. It's the same program. The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that book that Frank said is significant in colleges of education, is not significant in colleges of education. It is the 3rd most cited piece of literature in the sciences, social sciences and humanities. It holds pride of place in every college of education in North America. It is the central text of every college of education and has been since 1992. That's 30 years. Everybody hold on, I know. Breathe a minute. It's okay. That was 30 years ago. These people have been working on this very, very diligently for a long time. How can we know? I said they wrote it in their history books. They brag about it. I might talk about the Pedagogy of the Oppressed explicitly. I've read it in detail multiple times. It's a charming book of communism, is what it is. And what Paulo Freire, its author, achieved is the theft of our education system right out from under us. So we'll probably come back to him. But what you have to understand that has happened with this theft of education is that they have literally transformed the entire system, and they are proud of it. There's a guy at Iowa State University where I'm speaking in 2 days. Isaac Gottsman is his name. He wrote a book published in 2016. He is a Marxist educator. He wrote a book called The Critical Turn in Education, which chronicles how critical theory or how critical pedagogy, the application of Marxist theory in the kind of late 20th century mode, that's called critical theory or critical Marxism, how did that take over education, which is called critical pedagogy? And so he calls this book The Critical Turn in Education, and he explains, and the first sentence of the book says, where did all the 60s radicals go? That's the question. It's literally the first sentence of the book. Where did all the 60s radicals go? And the answer he gives, he says, not to the religious cults and not to yuppiedom, to the classroom. All the 60s radicals, those people that were bombing things, the people that were holding up federal judges like Angela Davis, etc., where did they go? K through 12 activism. That's where they went. And by 1992, their book was the chief text of colleges of education. So from 1972 or thereabouts, when Counter-Revolution and Revolt was written, to 1992, in that 20-year span, they marched into the colleges of education. So people ask all the time, how could this have happened? We stopped paying attention to education. We said, well, the Department of Education shouldn't exist, and that was the conservative position on it for 40 years. Meanwhile, the left understood if they capture the Department of Education by capturing the colleges of education and capturing all the teachers, they can transform the entire world, say by, I don't know, an auspicious date like 2030. That's how this happened. All of these activists went into the classrooms. All of these activists went into the colleges of education. What did Herbert Marcuse, the leading Marxist thinker of the 1960s, write in that book, Counter-Revolution and Revolt, in 1972 that I mentioned? Why did he write that book? He wrote that book, just to play historian off of Frank a little bit, he wrote that book because his radical vision that he first laid down specifically in 1964 in his book called One-Dimensional Man, which sold 300,000 copies that year. So this guy was an intellectual rock star on the left. And then he reinforced in an essay in 65 called Repressive Tolerance, and he developed further in an essay on liberation in 1969. That philosophy led to the riots of the late 60s and early 70s. His philosophy. And by 1972, it was clear it wasn't going to take over. So he wrote a book called Counter-Revolution and Revolt. And in that book, he explicitly says that what Marxists had been doing wrong is they had been trying to work from the outside instead of from the inside. He said, it is necessary for us to take our consciousness into the working fields and bring it with us, to do the job from within, to learn to program computers, to be a computer programmer, and to have critical consciousness and infect the field from within. He said this, in fact, and he emphasized this part, not only does this have to happen in computer programming, in the sciences, in manufacturing, or whatever else, he said that this needs to creep into two areas in particular: a leftist media apparatus and I quote, education at all levels. And those instructions were the instructions that laid the tracks to do what they literally called the long march through the institutions. And they realized that the kind of, railway station for the long march through the institutions was education. Because where are you going to, not only do you educate children and future members of society, future citizens, you educate every future professional. Every future professional. Where do you get doctors? Med school. Capture the med schools, you got them. Where do you get lawyers? Law school. Capture the law schools, you got them. Where do you get politicians? The bottom of the lake. Just kidding. It's the bottom of the swamp. We all knew the real answer. They are all professionals. They've all gone to professional schools. If you capture the schools, you capture not just the future, but also the future professionals. I remember talking to a fella in Colorado a few years back, and he said that his big moment, his big realization moment, his name's Alan, his big moment of realization was he kept talking to all these people, and the kind of thing everybody said is, well, these kids are getting their degrees, and they're going to go out into the real world, and that's going to straighten them out. And he said it was maybe 2017 he had his big realization, and it was, no, they're going to go remake the real world to suit them. And if you get enough of them, that's exactly what they'll do. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what they did. What good is a gender studies degree? It's a $250,000 a year job as a DEI consultant. That's what it is. How you doing? What good is a degree in climate justice, which is made up? It's a $1 million a year job as an ESG officer at a major corporation. How you doing? How many $1 million a year jobs you got? How do you get one of those? If you pardon, I know this is North Dakota, but you're probably ready for this. You get that by getting a degree in communist bullshit. And then you make sure there's an apparatus that rewards having a degree in Soviet bullshit. And then they Sovietize your institution one after another. That's how you do this. This is how they have done this. And you say, how could they have pulled this off? Because they did it for 50 years while nobody paid attention. 1972 was 50 years ago. 1992, they had the schools, the colleges of education. The quote that Isaac Gottsman gives regarding, by the way, Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed in the year 1992, which is why I invoked that year, is that by 1992, Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed had arrived where he now remains, which is everywhere. That's how the historian of the critical takeover of education explains the relevance of that character with the fist on his book. So that's what's gone on. Now, what's the purpose? Now, Frank made it really clear what the purpose is. He showed pictures. He showed pictures of torn down statues. Those are olds that have been destroyed. Some of the Jyo have been destroyed. The Sojyo. He showed pictures of parents, and this was the Chinese picture, the girl standing there with her fist defiant, and there's these sad-looking old people behind, the older generation destroyed. You get people to go out, you raise them up to be radicals and revolutionaries, and you get them to go out when a spark happens, like when George Floyd dies, to go run around like wild animals and destroy cities. To act like it's the biggest thing in the universe and that if everybody doesn't participate, they're the worst person on the planet. And you shame one another and you humiliate one another. There's a term for that in Chinese. They used it in the Maoist prisons in the 1950s. That term is pipan dojang. It means critical struggle. It's a struggle session. That's the term we use in English. The reason it's called a struggle session is because in Chinese, it's literally dojang, which is to struggle, to grapple with, to be struggled into wanting to see the world in the correct way, shamed, humiliated, badgered, ostracized, isolated, until you see the world in the right way. In the prisons in China that Mao ran, the goal of that process, struggle, was to, and I quote, make you want to confess. You've been accused of a crime that you didn't commit, it was made up. The CCP threw you in prison, and the job of the struggle session, which took place in your social circumstance in the prison, was to make you want to confess. Because when you confess, we can wrap up your case and let you out of prison. In order to confess, you had to be able to see your crimes from the perspective of the people, from the people's standpoint. Renmin Li Chang. You had to be able to see your crimes from the people's standpoint. And what was Paulo's book called? The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which teaches you to see your role in society from the standpoint of the oppressed. It's the same program. It's the same program. So what you get when you program or indoctrinate, or in Chinese, 洗脑, brainwash, means literally wash brain. That was the term they used for it in exactly the context I was just discussing. When you brainwash a generation of children and George Floyd dies, they take to the streets. They burn things down. Because, as AOC told us, they're hungry, they steal a bunch of Reebok sneakers and flat-screen TVs and stuff. Because they're structurally miseducated by the structural conditions of racism, they didn't know better, which is a supremely racist thing to say, but it's a way to outsource the racism, so it's not really a racist thing to say. They're on the side of justice. This is the program. And these kind of things happen. There was recently, we all saw the horrific school shooting that happened in Uvalde, Texas. And what happened immediately, so far away over here in Providence, Rhode Island, which is not Texas, by the way. Urged by their teachers, just like Frank was talking about. How often, you ever seen 9-year-olds organize? Like anything? Somehow all the students in the Providence schools took it upon themselves to have a march out of school because of the school shooting in Texas, in Providence, Rhode Island. And they marched to the State House because, as you know, Rhode Island is the size of this room, and it wasn't that far. And so they marched to the State House, and hundreds of them, by the hundreds, during school hours, and they did a die-in. They laid down on the steps of the State House and pretended that they died as a political protest. Now, it just so happens to turn out that the school system there in Providence is really, obviously they've got the political activism part covered somehow. The kids know to do this and know how to do this and did do this during school hours, which I'm sure that's what you sent your kids to school to learn to do. But meanwhile, their numbers are not that good. It currently turns out to be that 6% of the students, 6, not 60, I didn't stutter, 6% of the students in Providence, Rhode Island can do mathematics at grade level. 14% can read at grade level. I heard the numbers here are actually a lot better than that, but they're still floating at a nice, sweet 50, which is not a number to be proud of. It beats the national average if those numbers are true. The national average, I think, is something in the high 40 or low 40s. Our children are not learning to read. They're not learning to do math. They're not historically literate. They're learning honest history instead, which is fake news. They're not learning the sciences. They're not learning anything except how to be political activists in the moment. how to have the consciousness necessary to know that this is a political activist moment for leftist causes, and to take some kind of symbolic performative, we'll come up with a word in a minute, performative action to make a statement to get lawmakers to do something that they want, to get the policies that they want put into place. And why? Because their education has been stolen from them. And the roadmap is in that book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The means by which education has been transformed is in that book. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about the history of China, since you probably don't know it, partly because we have red-washed education, partly because it's China. We just don't know it. So if you don't know, in the 1920s, the conditions in China were that that the empire had been overthrown. The Nationalist Party, which was called the Kuomintang, was in power. The Kuomintang had the idea of unifying all of these kind of different provinces and states and kind of groups of people. There were actually 56 different ethnic groups that variously identified in some way or another as Chinese or not Chinese. The Han Chinese group is the biggest. In the 1920s, like I said, the power was held by Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party. And they were trying to unify the Chinese people under a nationalist ideal. It wasn't socialist also, so it was a socialist endeavor. And they were promoting this idea of national unity under a national identity that they called Huaran, which just means Chinese person as a slang term. It doesn't literally mean Chinese person, but it was the term that they used for the kind of a unified Chinese person. In America, it would be we're all Americans. The Huaran, we're all Chinese. Okay, so in 1923, a young aspiring communist agent on the directions of Moscow by the name of Mao Zedong infiltrated, and didn't really infiltrate, he just joined the Nationalist Party while being a member of the CCP at the same time. And part of his goal, part of his mission there was to start sowing the idea that this concept of the Huaran, that we're all one Chinese people, despite the 56 ethnic groups of China, was actually a way for the Han Chinese to make everybody have to be Han, and the other 55 groups to have to assimilate into a kind of broad Han-ness, if we wanted to say that. So Huaran really meant Han-run, so Chinese people really meant Han Chinese people, and all of your ethnic differences, if you're an ethnic minority group in China, have been obliterated. You have to assimilate, we would say, in the modern times into whiteness. You have to act white if you want to be president, like Barack Obama. There's an entire book written in critical race theory in 2013 called Acting White, that the first chapter explains how Barack Obama had to act white in order to become president. He had to assimilate into whiteness. White culture is American culture, so he had to act white. The Chinese did this in the 20s, and in the 30s, and in the 40s. And finally, in 1949, there was enough instability after racial and other forms of identity politics for them to mount a revolution and for Mao Zedong to take over. We won't go into the nitty-gritty details of what happened between the 50s and 66, between 1950 and 1966. Mao screwed up. He starved everybody. Whoops, they kicked him out of power. He comes back, gets power back. That's the short version. Kicks out the Gang of Four, mounts this thing called the 100 Flowers campaign where everybody was supposed to have free speech now. Everybody could speak out, so he made lists of all of his enemies. Then when he sees absolute power, he killed all of them. Great guy, this Mao Zedong guy. But in 1966, he mounts the Cultural Revolution, and that's when it's time for the students to rise up. That's when the students were going to destroy the four olds, and the students who were committed to destroying the four olds were called the Red Guard, hence the title of this program tonight. Creating the American Red Guard is what's been happening in our schools, because they watched in China, and they saw it worked. You know who praises the revolution in China? Both of the big Marxist names I've invoked so far other than Mao. Paulo Freire, in his books, both The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which he wrote in 1970, and The Politics of Education, which he published in 1986 or 85, and should have known better by then, he praises the Chinese Cultural Revolution very specifically. And Herbert Marcuse, in the same works that I mentioned, praises the Chinese Cultural Revolution. The model works. Didn't matter that it starved maybe as many as 50 or more million people or murdered them. Doesn't matter that it raised children in the schools, not just to destroy artifacts of their culture, but to turn on their teachers, to turn on their parents, their grandparents, their priests, the authority figures of the country who are not in line with the revolutionary vision of Mao, and beat them and shame them in the streets until they were either put into prison, rendered irrelevant, carted off to labor camps, or died. The youth revolution was the model that they came up with. Herbert Marcuse, in his essay on liberation in 1969, says explicitly that the youth rebellion is the rebellion that's going to work, and it's going to work by ministering identity politics to the minority races, the minority sexes, the feminists, the outsiders. That's going to be, he said, the new working class, the new proletariat, who will become the revolutionary class in itself, because the working class had been stabilized by the successes of capitalism. That's literally the point of the essay. This has been a plan in the works for a very long time. So what Mao did, off of his experience dealing with the nationalists, which he overthrew by 1949, and using identity politics to do that, what Mao did with the youth, he radicalized youth. How did he radicalize youth? Well, first of all, he was in charge, so he had control of the schools, so he started to put this kind of programming into the schools. And I say the word programming meaning both things at once, like the program that they follow and programming the children, like indoctrination. He put this kind of programming because they had the power, but what he also did was he separated everybody in Chinese society into 10 identity categories. Those identity categories, they were broken into two groups. One was, I know this is uncomfortable in the present critical race theory infused America, but one was labeled black, they were bad. One was labeled red, they were good. The black and red are for fascism and communism. It's not a racial thing. They were busy with the Han and Hmong and everything else over there. So the black identity groups, as Mao named them, were things like rich farmer, landlord. Do they like those people? How about landlords? Did we hear anything about that in the last 2-3 years? How they feel about landlords? Rich farmers, landlords, counter-revolutionaries, so people fighting back against Mao's thing. Bad influences. That's one Merrick Garland called y'all domestic terrorists. Bad influences. And just to make a fine enough point on it, the fifth category of black identity categories was right-wingers. Just a broad brush there. Rich farmers, landlords, counter-revolutionaries, bad influences, and right-wingers. That's the bad people. And if you were bad, your children were bad. If you had a black identity, your children adopted a black identity. If you had a black identity and your friends still associated with you, they adopted a black identity. It was contagious. A red identity, on the other hand, was laborer. Laborers, by the way, use hammers. Peasants. Peasants wield sickles. And then Revolutionary Guard, Revolutionary Cadre, Revolutionary Martyrs. So you join the revolution, you have a red identity, or if you're the people we pretend to care about, peasants and laborers, you have a red identity by default. Otherwise, you have a black identity. But if you're a peasant or a laborer and you happen to be, say you're pretty well off, well, I guess peasants aren't technically, but you're doing okay. That's what the Soviets called kulaks. You have to be dekulakized. They have to get rid of those people. See, that's when they use a pandemic to make sure that all the small businesses close and the big ones stay open until you're out of business. That's called dekulakization. That's a program. The communists have run this program for a century on every country they've tried to take over. You don't want people who can manage for themselves. But maybe you're kind of right-wing and you're just a peasant. You're just an everyday laborer, but you're right-wing. No. That's a black identity. That's contagious. You're bad. So he separates the society and the children into that. Now, it's not hard to get children. I hate to tell you this. Your children probably love you, but if they're young enough, they'll sell you out for a sucker. Then you know it. If it's not a sucker, it's an ice cream cone. It doesn't take much. Or getting to wear a special uniform at school with like a red sash or a feather and a little hat. And so you bully and you ostracize and you struggle the kids whose parents have black identities, who are labeled as black identities themselves, and you give them a pathway into a red identity. Just join the Revolutionary Guard. Turn in your parents. Go desecrate a temple. knock over a statue, profess your love for Mao in front of everybody. When we give you a red identity, you can have a nicer lunch. Here's your ice cream cone. That's all it took. And he slowly radicalized the children through separating them into identity politics. There's a book studying this Chinese phenomenon in Chinese prisons and Chinese schools that was written in the early 1960s by a psychologist named Robert Lifton. And Robert Lifton wrote this book interviewing guys, no, not just guys, people that had been imprisoned in the Chinese prisons, the brainwashing prisons, the thought reform prisons, he called them, and then eventually confessed, had their confession accepted, got let out of prison. And they did not put you back into Chinese society when you got out of the thought reform prison, when you got out of Gulag. They put you on a boat and sent you out of the country. And so they shipped him to Hong Kong, and Robert Lifton happened to be in Hong Kong for another purpose entirely. He realized this was an interesting phenomenon and petitioned to get to stay there for an extra year and a half and interviewed people within days of coming off of these boats, literally out of prison on, say, Sunday, on a boat on Monday, in Hong Kong by Friday, interviewed by Sunday the next week. That quick. And he interviewed these people, and he wrote a book in 1961 or 2 called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, a Study of Brainwashing in China. And he documents the Xinao and the Pipon Dojang and all of this stuff in the book. And he talks about it. And he says the outstanding fact of thought reform is that it penetrates into the inner lives and emotions of the people. The way that it works is by setting up conflicting circumstances where people are put into extraordinary circumstances of discomfort and given a very limited set of options for how they might manage that discomfort. And I suggest to you that what Mao was doing in the schools is the same thing. You bully the crap, you struggle the crap out of the black identity students. We heard what they were. Kids who have parents who are right-wingers or bad influences or counter-revolutionaries, people like us speaking up or showing up to things like this. You bully them, get them to turn in their parents, and you give them a feather, and off they go. So now let's fast forward to the United States, 2020 to 2022. And they introduce heavily into the schools programs such as critical race theory, gender ideology, sometimes it's called. Queer theory is what it really should be called. All of these different identity theories, but I really want to focus on critical race theory and queer theory as a 1-2 punch. I don't know if any of you are boxers. You get some little rope-a-dope going on over here. Critical race theory is the setup, overwhelmingly. Yes, it's very effective. Yes, it's very dangerous. Yes, it's very poisonous. Yes, it creates the revolutionary red guard that's ready to burn down cities, as we already saw in 2020 when the right spark lands. Yes, all of that. But it's also just a setup. You tell a bunch of insecure 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old, especially girls, that they are intrinsically bad because of the color of their skin, but if they undergo a sex change, that they're now intrinsically good. And you all of a sudden have a bunch of black identity categories: straight, white, male, cisgender, hetero. Well off, maybe. And then you create a bunch of good identities that they can be dumped into: trans, pansexual, all these made-up sexualities. Microsoft just put out a flag with 121 different flags turned into some kind of kaleidoscope of epilepsy or something that they published. And a friend of mine told me, and I believe her, that if high school students can't draw that whole thing from memory, this is all just a bunch of baloney. They're just posturing. It's just virtue signaling. It doesn't mean anything. But they've got countless navel-gazing, narcissistic identity categories you can join, or you can be an ally. You won't be an ally correctly. Your allyship is actually toxic. It's actually problematic. It actually reproduces domination. It allows you to step out of the frame of your accusation of racism so that you don't have to do the work any longer. It's a means of exhibiting your white fragility. So it's still problematic. You can become an ally, but then if you transform yourself sexually, or transform your body, or decide to socially transition, and the school will help you without telling your parents in most states. And if that's not good enough, you can run to California now, which has made it legal for them to take custody of your children if they claim that they are trans sanctuary seekers. If you join that group, you're good now. And it's not good enough to become, say, bisexual or just different or non-binary. Articles are already being published on the long racist history of those. And you see them and you laugh, and you're not the target. Your 12-year-old is. Your 12-year-old is the head they want that to get into. Oh, you can't be non-binary. Non-binary is not enough. You've got to go full trans. Oh, you're just going to kind of pretend trans. How white of you, how privileged of you. You've got to go all the way or you're not a full committed person. And they're driving them into mental and physical destruction. Why? Why this focus on sexualizing children? Why drag queens? Why these weird books like Genderqueer, which literally it's inappropriate for me to quote from standing in front of you here. Literally, it's so inappropriate that angry parents have taken physical copies of this book to school board meetings and tried to read those books out loud at the school board meetings and have been censored because they violate the law to read out loud in front of children. But they provide them to children in the school libraries enthusiastically and then defend them and then on the news say they're not there, but it's good that they are. Which is the same gaslighting Frank experienced his entire life as a teacher when he started to see this. Oh yeah, critical race theory is not there. He's like, what about this document saying it's here? No, it's not there. Document's fake news. But that's it. Why are they doing this? Well, part of it's to make that red guard, but part of it's that communists for over 100 years, Western communists as they're sometimes called, Western Marxists or cultural Marxists, which I've been told, in fact, the Human Rights Campaign, you know that blue field with the yellow equal sign that's supposed to represent LGBT stuff but is a communist front organization, so therefore represents them as well as the Maoists represented the peasants and the laborers, which is to say it didn't represent them at all. They have told me that they have published actually that I use alt-right terminology such as cultural Marxism, which is what the cultural Marxists called themselves until apparently it became alt-right terminology. It used to have an entry on Wikipedia, but about 2 years ago they changed it. If you look it up, when you get a chance, look it up. Wikipedia.com, cultural Marxism, type it in, see what comes up. It says cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. They replaced the entry. It used to have a section for a conspiracy theory about it. That's the whole article now. They got rid of the rest of it. It's not there. You can find the rest of it, I think, still on the Wayback Machine, but they'll get rid of that, the archives. Why do they do this? Because they've known that sexualizing children does something extremely powerful. It does something extremely powerful, and I cannot express to you how much danger your children are in with this. This isn't cute. It's not funny. It's not about LGBT empathy. As a matter of fact, there's a paper about the Drag Queen Story Hour written by the drag queen, whose real name is Harris Kornstein, but he goes by Lil Miss Hot Mess, that is one of the chief organizers of the Drag Queen Story Hour program. Wrote an academic paper for a major academic journal called Curriculum Inquiry, which is one of the biggest academic journals in education and in curriculum. And they said that, yeah, we know it's a marketing strategy that's necessary to say that Drag Queen Story Hour is about promoting LGBT empathy, but it's actually about being a generative model to induce the situation so that children can learn to live queerly. That's their words about living queerly. In fact, they put it in italics every time it appears in the paper. They close that paper somewhat ominously with the words that they are leaving a trail of glitter in the carpet that will never come out. That's their objective, their stated objective. In their words, they explain that Drag Queen Story Hour is family-friendly in the sense of family being a queer code for the family you find on the street after you leave your actual family, in a section about the point of Drag Queen Story Hour being to induce alternate modes of kinship, other families, new families, like the one you abandoned your family for. And since the 1920s at least, Marxists have known who wanted to take over the West and realized, unlike Russia, which was a peasant society, unlike China, which was a peasant society, if you want to take over stable, thriving Western nations, you have to aufheben der Kultur. You have to abolish the culture. You have to erode the culture. You have to destroy the four olds. You have to make children hate their culture. And sexualizing the children does 4 primary things. The first thing it does is it makes them question the prevailing culture that says that they aren't supposed to be this way. The second thing it does is it makes them question the religions that that culture looks up to as divine and holy. Oh yeah, the Bible says man and female, they were created. God knew you from before, blah, 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 the whole thing. Yeah, that's obsolete. 4 old, the obsoletes. Bye, see you, old thing. Abolish the old thing. Destroy the old things. Predominant culture, it segregates children from the prevailing culture. Their religion segregates them from their religion. Family. Hey, Mom, I'm pansexual. You're what? I'm also demi-romantic. That's not a thing. You don't understand. Segregated from the family. My parents don't want to affirm me. They're not gender affirming. I need to be socially transitioned at school. Use my pronouns and preferred name at school, but send things home in my birth name and birth pronouns so my parents don't catch on that you're doing this with me at school. That's happening all across this country. Why? Segregate from the family. To create the image in the children's minds that their families are the thing they have to be protected from. That the family is this thing that doesn't get it, that has to be protected from. Segregate the child from the family. And the most insidious part is the part we don't talk enough about, which is to segregate the children from themselves, or as Marx would say it, to create self-estrangement, or man alienated from himself, from his true nature. See, when you induce this kind of doubt at this kind of level about fundamental categories of who you are and what it means to be who you are, and to frame this in terms of the correct answers to how you should be, you cause children not to be able to form stable categories or to be able to understand themselves, except in terms of these very, very polarizing conceptions of self and other. We talk all the time, and I know if you're here, you probably talk or know to a degree about the physical harms that come with the transition process. We could talk about them in tremendous detail, and probably at some venues we should. We should talk about them in true, exquisite detail. We're talking puberty blockers that have a high probability of sterilizing. We have cross-sex hormones that will sterilize and cause other problems that are too graphic to describe. We're talking about surgeries to remove things that, as the detransitioning community starts to emerge, are telling us that they believed could grow back. You're not a lizard, baby. It's not growing back. This irreversible damage that Abigail Schreier wrote about, for example, we talk all the time about the physical destruction that comes along with being indoctrinated or programmed into, thought reformed into this way of thinking, that it's the only way to elevate into a positive social identity while all of your other social identities are being denigrated. We don't talk about the psychological destruction that it causes. We don't talk about childhood developmental psychology, which, by the way, they are actively trying to use queer theory to, as they say, queer, to transform so that it says what they need it to say so they can continue doing what they're doing. We don't talk about how there are concrete developmental stages that children go through for proper identity formation. We don't talk about the fact that there are age-appropriate topics for children, not because they're age-appropriate in some metaphysical sense, but because that if you cross those boundaries, inappropriate emotional, romantic, or physical or sexual relationships between adults and children, it causes personality disorders. That's where they come from. You were not popped out of the womb with a personality disorder. It was caused by an inappropriate relationship with somebody older than you, virtually every time. The psychological damage to estrange you from yourself. And why would they want to estrange people from themselves? Family, culture, religion, it makes sense. Why yourself? Because what did Herbert Marcuse tell us? What was the problem of capitalism that necessitated identity politics as a new red guard, or a new working class, as he called it, a new proletariat? It was that capitalism stabilized the worker. It stabilized the average person economically. And so if people are psychologically stable, they won't be revolutionaries either. So you have to create psychologically unstable young people. So in addition to that, you send them to the doctor through a telemedicine screen at school. in the state of North Carolina, which is not this North state, that can happen at any age. Even California has the decency to wait till 12. But in North Carolina, it can happen at any age. And a doctor can prescribe behind the parent's back pharmaceuticals to a child at school. If the school thinks it's in the best interest because the parent might not be affirming of what's happening, then they don't have to tell the parent. They can prescribe your kid antidepressants, stimulants like Ritalin or Adderall, puberty blockers, anti-anxiety medications. They can medicate the crap out of your kids and make sure that they're completely destabilized from themselves while they pump them full of social and emotional learning content geared to frame all of their thoughts in terms of an equity frame of identity politics and of the broader, I mentioned the year 2030, the broader new push that they've really hit the accelerator on toward sustainability. So I don't really have time or want to stand up here and tell you about how horrific social emotional learning is in practice, but I do want to point out that that is the brand name for the thing that's injecting this brainwashing program into your children. Social emotional learning, however much you trust it, and I don't care if that's on a scale of 1 to 100, 100, I don't care if it's 0, I don't care if it's negative 100, whatever your number is, it's too high. You trust it too much. It is the single most dangerous thing happening in this country. Inflation right now is out of control. It's extremely dangerous. What's happening in our military with this exact same program is extremely dangerous. And what they're doing to our children with social emotional learning with billions upon billions upon billions of dollars is much more dangerous. However much you trust it, you must trust it less. Social emotional learning is the hypodermic needle injecting these identity politics into the kids, and it's injecting the politics into the kids in a way so that every instance of struggle or confusion or stress is going to be addressed through an equity-based or inclusion-based or sustainable-based lens to help them resolve the right answers to those difficult questions that are being generated for them. Remember I said that Drag Queen Story Hour is generative? What is a generative theme? By the way, that comes out of that book. Paulo Freire invented the generative themes method of teaching. It is that you are to mine out of the students through surveys, through dialogue, through whatever, through prompting, through the presence of a drag queen. You are to mine out of the students concepts that are relevant to their actual lived context. You are then to frame them in a way that allows you to raise consciousness with the student as the lesson plan by framing them through the correct lenses, which Paulo Freire called a process of codification and decodification into conscientization, which is a lot of hogwash. But that's the thought reform program. This generative method is the reason. That's why the kids are watching Disney Plus and it's all weirdo so they can go ask questions at school. And that can be extremely subtle. And social emotional learning is built explicitly, in the words of Linda Darling Hammond, one of its core consultants, core advocates, core lobbyists, right now working at CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, was on Obama and Biden's education transition teams. She explicitly says in the foreword to the Social Emotional Learning Handbook that she wrote in 2015, she wrote the foreword, not the whole book, that it is explicitly based off of the concepts of Paulo Freire's notions of humanization and transformation, which are explicitly Marxist. She says that explicitly. That's what it's about. That's what social emotional learning is about. Just to give you just some idea of how insidious it can be, this generative thing can be a drag queen. So you get a drag queen in front of the kids and they say, "Why are you dressed as a girl?" And they can say, now they have opening to talk as long as they want because the kid brought it up. He generated it. So now you can talk as long as you want. Do boys have to dress like boys? Can boys dress like however they want? Is there some rule? Why are you being all like crazy and funny in class? Do people always have to follow all the rules? Those are literally explicitly given as examples of generative themes brought up by the presence of a drag queen in their performance in Drag Queen Story Hour in schools. It's to get the kid to ask the question so you can talk about the issue. That's what it's for. It can be, let's read a whole bunch of stuff like 1619 Project History or Twisted History. Now let's talk about slavery, and now let's talk about racism for the rest of the day because somebody asked a question about it or it raised the issue. relentless surveying of the kids to find out what they can prime into them to have the discussion. Here it can be extremely subtle, though. This is a real example that a real educator named Jennifer McWilliams gave to me from a real training that she did. There's a second grade math word problem. Nobody stress out. You're going to be able to answer the question. The last talk I did in Charleston, there was actually like a 7-year-old in the audience who immediately answered it. So you're good. The question is, Johnny is riding with his mom and dad in the car on the way to an amusement park. The amusement park is 50 miles away. They've already driven 30 miles. How many more miles are there to go? Second grade math word problem. Here's how a social emotional learning lesson works to create generative themes out of that. Hey kids, I trust everybody knows the answer. But before we answer the question, let's talk about amusement parks. Who's been to an amusement park before? Some kids raise their hand. Obviously they're 7. Some kids don't raise their hand. Not everybody at 7 years old has been to one. Oh, well, what are some reasons why some kids have been to amusement parks and other kids haven't? Oh, I'm scared of them. And, my dad doesn't like them. Or whatever reason. Kids love to talk. They're gonna volunteer. This is build is engagement. It builds interest. We're going to have a dialogue. It's going to be engaging. But eventually somebody raises their hands. Not everybody can afford to go to an amusement park. And now you're having a conversation about poverty that can easily spin into a conversation of poverty's correlation with race. And then it can turn into, okay, so what are some things we could do about that? Make it free. Make rich people pay for poor people. And now you're having a conversation about socialism with second graders off of this completely innocuous word problem. So they're going to the amusement park and they're riding in the car. Who's ridden in a car? Is it a good idea, guys? Do you think it's a good idea to burn all that gas and drive the car all the way just to have fun? Now you're having a conversation about environmentalism. Riding in the car with mom and dad. You see where this one's going. Does everybody have a mom and dad at home? Do your mom and dad drive you guys together? Some kid raises his hand. My mom, I don't have a dad at home. It's just me and my mom. She's a single mom. Conversation about feminism. I have 2 moms. Conversation about sexuality. It's generative. That's how it works. You would never, ever look at that question and realize we've had a poverty conversation, a sustainable environmental conversation, a race conversation, a sexuality conversation, a feminist conversation already out of this. And then who's been and who hasn't? And somebody raises their hand and says, well, I haven't been because my dad doesn't think I'm old enough. Oh, let's talk about parental authority. Do you think parents really should be able to decide who gets to go when? Or do you think the kids should decide? And what are 7-year-olds going to say? Kids! And now you're having a conversation about parental authority. Do we think that maybe the school could maybe we could go to the amusement park and we could take it away and then the parents aren't going to be able to make that decision. So some of you that didn't get to experience it can do it. And do you ever answer the math question? Maybe. But remember, this was a math class. This was a 2nd grade math class, and it just got hijacked into 6 different political conversations depending on what the generative theme social emotional learning teacher wanted to do. And in every single case, whatever got brought up generatively by asking the students to engage is going to be twisted through an equity lens. How do we make it more financially equitable, racially equitable, sexually equitable, gender equitable, blah, blah, blah? How do we make it more environmentally sustainable? There's a document from UNESCO published this year saying that every college, you should hear this in North Dakota, every college, every higher education institution in the world is to be dedicated as quickly as possible, they don't give a hard deadline, to the United Nations 2030, Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals to transform our world as they're called. Every higher education institution should be fully dedicated. They say that the colleges should rewrite their mission statements. They say that colleges need to start hiring. They don't have enough DEI officers, I guess, or maybe they do. Now they have to start hiring chief sustainability officers. And they also say that colleges and universities, while maintaining academic freedom, not quite explaining how, in fact, they say this improves academic freedom, must cease to engage in any activity whatsoever that supports unsustainable practices, namely specifically the fossil fuels industry. They specifically say colleges should do no research, do nothing that can be used to support the fossil fuels industry and other non-sustainable industries. No college in the world should be allowed to. In 2019, this same UNESCO, that's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, this isn't a small deal, this same organization published an article about social emotional learning called SEL for SDGs. Social emotional learning for sustainable development goals. And they say that schools should be retooled to teach their children, to program the children to achieve the sustainable development goals of Agenda 2030. But this is going to cause them a lot of stress, especially since some of the goals seem inherently self-contradictory, which will cause cognitive dissonance. And there's no better tool in social emotional learning for teaching them the resilience to manage the cognitive dissonance with turning them into activists for a self-contradictory communist program. They don't say the communist part. I added that part. This is what's happening in our schools. Frank was completely right. This is what's happening in our schools. This is the program of Maoist thought reform that creates the Red Guard, and the Red Guard's purpose is to destroy the four olds of society. The Red Guard was in China made out of their children. The Red Guard in America will be made out of your children. The tool then was Mao had control of the education department. The tool now is that Maoists, openly Maoists, have control of the education department. There's a book about critical race theory. It's huge. It's like this thick. It's called Critical Race Theory, the key writings that form the movement. Just like Pedagogy of the Oppressed with a fist on it, it's like huge and it's red. And do you know what critical race theorists, I've been told, call it behind closed doors? The Big Red Book. Just like Mao's Little Red Book. They know what they're doing. Your children are their project because their project is to use your children to transform the world. And like whatever I just said about social emotional learning, if that made you uncomfortable about it, I promise you, it's 1,000,000 times worse than that. I don't have time to get into how terrible and dangerous it is. But data mining your children to build a world around them should be considered very dangerous. So I've been asking this question around the country, and I want to ask it now. Then I'll give you some suggestions. But Frank already gave you an awesome set of suggestions for what to do, and I'm basically going to rehash it if I tell you what you should do, but I will. But I've been asking this question all over the country. I just released a video wearing my same shirt that I'm wearing now that I got in July, where I asked this question at the opener. If you knew that you were sending your children to a Maoist re-education camp for 30 to 35 hours a week every week and paying for it, what would you do differently? You should consider that question very seriously because that's what you're doing. My suggestion is that you should protect your children. The number one thing you should be doing is protecting your children. The school is on fire. Imagine the school building down the street's actually on fire. What would you do? You're going to go there. You're going to get your children out of the building. And then if you're a decent human being, you're going to make sure your child is safe, and you're going to turn around and help fight that fire. And then when the fire's out, you're going to help rebuild that building. Because that building is valuable and that building means something. That's what you have to do. How do you do it? Well, Frank already gave you the recipe. To boil it down to kind of 4 simple points, you've got to get educated, or you got to get together first. You're already doing that somewhat, but keep doing it. It's cold. Go get coffee. It's not Wisconsin, so I won't say go to the bar. It's cold. Get together. So you have to get together. You have to get educated or informed. Share resources with one another. Show people these videos of the teachers doing this stuff. They get leaked out. Show people podcasts. Share them. Have meetings about them. Book club, podcast club. Talk about it. Get people together. Get informed. Share information. Get organized after you're informed. Don't go Leroy Jenkins this thing. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. Don't go stumbling into this blind and mess up. Get informed, get organized, and then take action. It starts as simply as telling 2 or 3 friends and asking them to tell 2 or 3 friends too. Get them to look into this. This is the biggest issue of our lives. I know you have better things to do. I have better things to do, or I think I do, but I don't. I don't have anything better to do than saving my country. I don't have anything better to do than protecting my children. It's a lie we tell ourselves. We're not that busy. We're busy. We're not that busy. So you have to do something. People ask me all the time, ask Frank, what do we do? And I'm like, I don't know. What do you do? What can you do? I don't know. But you need to find what you can do and you need to do it. Maybe you're like Frank or I and you dig into things and you share information well. Start doing it. Frank started doing it. Frank's on a stage. A few months later, you're going to be on a stage if that's what you're good at. Maybe you're good at getting people together. Get them in a room. Get a room 3 times this big and standing room only. Maybe you're good at just helping people take care of their kids. Get them together. Maybe you're good at relieving people's stress. Maybe you're good at baking and can do a bake sale to support organizations like this with some of the money that you make. What can you do? It's up to you to ask what you can do, what your gifts of the Spirit are, as my pastor friends say all the time, and to rise up to that. That's what you can do. But getting together in person and sharing information and showing up together at the grassroots level is overwhelmingly the most important thing you can do. Supporting dissident teachers is very important. Supporting detransitioners because they are heavily beleaguered. Protecting your kids, protecting your communities, showing up to school board meetings. When they tell you you can't speak, show up again anyway. When they tell you you can't speak again, make a video about it, put it out on the internet, share it locally, try to get on the radio, find somebody, just keep pressing at it. These are things that you do. Because it feels very discouraging, but I'll tell you this. I keep telling people this. I've been saying this all day today. How do you go bankrupt, or how does this movement that we're fighting against lose? Slowly at first, then all at once. And that happens by more and more and more people getting involved, seeing what's going on, realizing it can't be trusted, and starting to find people and put people into positions of authority, like school board members, like commissioners, etc., who will take the right steps to make the right decisions, to understand the issues, and fight back. That's how. Slowly at first, then all at once. I did my first talk on this subject, social justice, first public talk, in July of 2017, and a lady sitting about right here in the middle stood up and yelled at me that I didn't know what I was talking about because social justice is an issue of economics, and I haven't mentioned economics once. It was a little disconcerting for my first public talk on the subject, I'll tell you that. I now speak 2 or 3 times a week. People are eager to have me. People recognize me in the airports. The movement is here. The movement is happening. You are the movement. People like you showing up and caring enough to show up and do something are what's going to set this country back, and that we're going to take education back. It's going to take a while, but we have to care about it first. So thank you for coming. That's what's going to do it. Frank's going to join me up here. We're going to answer some questions until we run out of time after this. Thank you so much. Thanks, man. Yeah, sure. You want it? I'll stay here.
Testing. Okay, good.
So all that noise I made a few minutes ago was actually your groomer school's YouTube. And I'm just wondering, yeah, I had no idea it would come out loud, but I was just wondering, can you get that into public schools? Will they take it in and listen to it if you take it to the school board?
I mean, you can try. They're not real receptive there. I mean, it's like, trying to march it into enemy territory. This is why supporting dissident or outspoken teachers is so important. They're actually, what I keep hearing, all these different places I go, I don't know that they're not playing it at the schools. That's not going to happen. The themes are also a little adult in some cases. But I hear teacher after teacher after teacher after teacher. Hey, I'm a teacher. Hey, I'm trying to get on the school board. Hey, I'm an educator. Hey, I'm a principal. Coming to these events that I get the privilege to speak at again and again and again. And I get the same thing Frank gets. They're listening, they hear it, they're learning, they know, and they're like, will you share some stuff for me because I don't want to lose my job. So this is why it becomes so important to support those people, in my opinion, because when they start to speak up, the dam breaks. How does this end? Slowly at first and all at once. Once that dam breaks, things will start to change very quickly. How does that dam break? It's that the average person who knows something's wrong but is too scared to speak up feels like conditions have changed enough where they have the courage to speak up. I don't belittle them, I don't mock them, I don't shame them for their current lack of courage. I applaud people like Frank who had the courage to stand up. I hope more people will. It's a bumpy ride. But I do encourage it. But when this gets to the point where the average person who has a thought in their head that this might be a problem feels like they can speak up without having to call Frank or me to try to share it for them, everything starts to change very, very quickly. That's a critical mass question. I actually stole this from one of the woke lectures where they were talking about how to change the world for environmentalism and climate change stuff. There's a TED talk about it. The woman's in a beanie. She's very, looks like a climate activist. and she's talking in the video that she says it only, I don't know if it's true actually, I've seen some stuff that corroborates it, but I don't know how true it is. She says it only takes 3.5% of a population to create a tipping point to where people will start to speak out. So supporting those people to give them that opportunity, I think, will make the situation be such that these messages can be shared in the schools. I think presently you're going to find that to be very, well, I'll very optimistically say that very strongly depends on the school district. So out of the 14,000 school districts in the United States, yeah, for like 8 of them maybe. But yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Frank.
Yeah, I'd say, I've had this idea about finding a way, like creating a community website, making it known amongst teachers where they can anonymously submit things, and then parents or whoever organizes it can relay it to the community.
Moms for Liberty, like?
Moms for Liberty,
Moms for
yeah.
Liberty, yeah.
There you go. And so kind of using certain teachers like as moles inside the organization to, capture what they can and get it out. For now, that's a solution, because I think the public needs to see that the stuff is actually going on, and there's no better people to prove that than teachers. Because there's a lot, when I was sharing stuff that was on like our school hard drive, teacher lesson plans, the school district was going after me saying I was like violating privacy rights. I'm like, what privacy rights do? Well, apparently they think they have privacy rights in the classroom with your children. So it's really hard going through the official channels to find out what's going on. Yeah.
Keep pushing, it'll get there. Don't give up hope, I'm telling you. I screamed into a hurricane for 5 years, and now there's literally an army behind me. It's wonderful. I'm the most hopeful person probably in this room right now, and because I might know the most about the situation in the room right now too. So let that be encouraging for you.
I have more of a comment than a question. I'm feeling I had not had extensive exposure to this topic previously, but when I'm adding things together, we have a newly elected school board member in Minot that promotes transgender. We have a Gay Straight Alliance club at the 9th and 10th grade level that I attempted to go to, and we were refused admittance, and it is put on by a graduate of this university with a degree in gender studies. We have a club the same type, Gay Straight Alliance at the 11th and 12th grade level. It's my understanding they meet every other Friday after school. Parents are not aware, others are not admitted. We also have a city council member that is promoting this agenda. So if you think it's not here, you're living in a hole.
Yeah, I'll actually add, if you don't mind, at lunch today, one of the Moms for Liberty folks that I was with told me that I just told you this thing about the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, that's what's in the schools. It's the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations is what is the programming in the schools. And they got called out on this, and so they backed it off to something like 12. So this stuff's happening here, even in little old Minot, North Dakota, but it's happening in little old everywhere town USA, city after city after city I go to. But again, also, look how many of you there are here. This is the beginnings of a huge pushback, a huge counter-revolution against what they're doing to put our schools and our country back on track. But you can't fight back. You can't fight back if you don't know what it is, but you really can't. You have no chance. You're not even at the starting line if you still deny that it's happening. So it's here. It's everywhere. Even little old whatever, doesn't matter. And there's only so many people like Frank and I who travel all over the country, and there can only really be so many of us because I have, people ask me all the time about what I do in my home state of Tennessee, and I'm like, really not much. It turns out there are 49 other states that also want my attention. And so once you become national, it's very difficult to be productive locally as well. I travel, several hundred times a year right now, or a couple hundred times a year. So it's really up to the people in these local communities to recognize what's happening. I don't want to sound like a scary person, but to recognize that there are individual human beings who are the ones who are implementing and supporting these programs, and nothing should happen to these people except that they should be removed from the positions that they're abusing. They are not handling the authority they have been entrusted with in a responsible manner and therefore must be relieved of their duties.
Here, I'll add to that. Here's a homework assignment for you. How many of you have gone to the Minot High School Library catalog and ever searched what books they have there? Okay. I didn't have time and didn't really know how to fit it in, but I did a little search a week ago. It was all there. Search the book Flamer, and this book is gay. They're at the Minot High School Library. There are things in there so explicit I couldn't talk about them. In one of the books, it talks about how you get on an app called Grindr, which is a gay hookup app for adults. Mentions it's for adults, but it tells you how to sign up for it. One of the books, the book Flamer, that's actually, I think it's currently being checked out by a student, has graphic descriptions about groups of boys drinking each other's bodily fluids. If you want, I mean, it was right there. You know, and I don't blame people for not. I'm like, who would think to go look for that stuff?
So let me tell you something very simple and very productive you can do, and I know that you don't want to bring magic bad luck on yourself, but it's not real, so you'll be okay. Find out what books are in that library that are seriously objectionable. It'd be great to create a database or a list so that people, parents that are interested, the Moms for Liberty that are here in North Dakota, can share this, etc. But take it upon yourself, several of you, maybe all of you, give the author a little money. It's totally okay. I'm an author. They don't get that much. It's okay. Buy a physical copy of the books that are actually provably in the library. Put them in a bag that you carry with you. Women advantage you. When you go out and you have coffee with a friend or lunch with a friend or a meeting or whatever, casually mention, did you know this book, Flamer, happens to be in the library at the Minot High School? I happen to have a copy of it. Have you ever seen it? Put a few tabs in the key pages, hand it over. It is psychologically overwhelming. I was very aware of another such book called Gender Queer. I had read the entire thing digitally, and then I went to Kansas in March, and a woman there by the name of Denise, it's a wonderful woman that invited me to the Kansas City and to Topeka, did exactly this. She had 3 or 4 of these different books in her purse, and she pulled out a copy of Gender Queer and said, you ever seen one of these for real? And I was like, no. And I looked at it, and it was psychologically overwhelming in a way that knowing everything that was in it was not. Seeing it physically and knowing it's real and saying this is in the library here, I promise you it's worth the $1.25 you gave them in royalties at the most. Probably more like 60 cents, by the way. It's worth your $20 to buy the book, to have it with you, and show other human beings in person the physical copy of these materials, pointing out, with evidence if you need to, this is in the Minot High School Public Library right now. It's an incredibly simple, incredibly powerful piece of activism. You can have those books at your house, courtesy of largecorporations.com, that I won't name specifically, that are named for rainforests in Brazil. You can have that at your house literally tomorrow and start doing this and showing people. And it is shocking in a way that I cannot communicate to physically handle one of these things and see it. It's so valuable. Don't underestimate the power of that.
I think it started out 7, 8 years ago with This Perfectly Normal. You guys know that book? Okay, that was the original. That was a book that we bought 100 copies of it, and we gave it out to every legislator at the legislative session. And still nothing. But one thing I was going to make comment is we're one of the few states, and I don't know, you said Leroy Jenkins, that means Ohio, right?
Sure.
In North Dakota, we have education in our Constitution. And we can use the Constitution, and we've got to start educating the people here to use it, because it says right in there, a high degree of intelligence, patriotism, integrity, and morality on the part of every voter in order to preserve a government and the happiness and welfare of the people. Our education is in the Constitution, and we can fight. Every school board member takes an oath to uphold the Constitution, and so does the superintendent of public instruction. And we can hold those people. When you saw Fargo stop the Pledge of Allegiance, we came out and we said, hey, we're going to decertify you with the business manager because you're violating the Constitution. And right away, a week or a couple days later, they reversed their decision. But we have to start studying the Constitution because there's a morality clause in our Constitution. And these things that we just had a big meeting in Valley City about the books. And it's about morality. And guess what? We need to teach abstinence of all sexuality of any kind so that we get back to what we're talking about, reading, writing, arithmetic. And we can push that. They are destroying our schools, and it's all right there in our Constitution.
Hey, thank you so much for that comment. That brings up something I wish I had said, so if I may. Actually, it turns out I'm from Tennessee, and our state constitution is also exemplar. It's really great. We have this whole provision that says that, you know, that we're required by constitutional agreement in our state to resist arbitrary power. So, I mean, it's just right there. It's fabulous. And it actually served us really well under COVID, as it turns out. Some Tennesseans stood up. But this is something positive. If you don't want to have to study this dark, evil stuff, right? Or if you're in an organization like Moms for Liberty that's taking it on or whatever, but you need something different, positive to do. Moms for Liberty, just full disclosure, I'm actually on the National Board of Advisors for the organization Moms for Liberty, which has like 115,000 members nationally, 40-something states they're represented in, 200 and something chapters. There is only one so far, they're by county in North Dakota. There's not one in my county either, mea culpa. But the way that organization founded, I had the privilege of attending and speaking at their national summit in July this year. The way that organization began, it turned out that several of the ladies that started it were former school board members in neighboring counties. In fact, one of them, Tina Deskovich, was a school board member on the school board of the school of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting when that happened. She was on the school board over that school, and Tiffany Justice is in the county north of Tina. They and a few other ladies started having these meetings. What can we do? They left the school board. What do we do now? And they started having these meetings they called Liberty Lady meetings. And what they actually did was line by line. You can bring your kids to this. You don't have to bring your kids to talking about the dark stuff. Line by line, they went through the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, until they understood every word of it. They spent a year just on those 3 foundational documents. Add your state constitution. Get together, people get together and have Bible studies. It's not sacrilege to get together and have founding document studies. There's 4 primary ones that you really need to work through: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States of America, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution of your state. That you can work. Sorry if you're in Oklahoma, by the way, their Constitution's 400 pages long. Best of luck with that. It was written during the Progressive era, and it's not so good. They defined the weight of kerosene and all of this other stuff in the Constitution. Sorry, Oklahomans. Everybody else can do it. But this is incredibly powerful, incredibly transformational. Think about what the founders of either your state or your nation had in mind when they were writing those words. What does it mean to say we hold these truths to be self-evident? That all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Why life? Why liberty? Why the pursuit of happiness? Have you ever thought about it? You probably haven't, or not much. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness is a proxy for property, if you understand the relationship between John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. Why those? Because if they can't take away your life, they can't take away your liberty, and they can't take away your ability to hold property, feed yourself, clothe yourself, and shelter yourself, then they can't tell you how you have to believe. You have fundamental liberty when those are secured. So those are your inalienable rights. If they can't beat you up, they can't take your property away from you, etc. So go through, learn these things, bring your kids. Civics lesson, better than they're ever, sorry for a history teacher, better than they're ever going to get in any school in this country, public or private. It's an amazing thing to do. It'll bring you together as a community. It'll bring you together as friends. A gigantic national organization that's changing the shape of this country right now was born out of exactly that activity. It can happen here in North Dakota as well as it could happen in the beaches of Florida. So give it a go. You got a cold winter ahead of you. It's going to be dark.
Okay, we have a question right over here.
Hi, first off, you guys were great, both of you. Full disclosure, I'm actually a political refugee from California, so a lot of the things that you guys are describing, I've seen come there. I've been here for about 12 years. I have 2 anchor children here, so I'm not going anywhere. But one of the things you guys mentioned is that our institutions and schools have been infiltrated. I mean, is there somewhere, I like to look at where to apply the heat. Is there a central head that's pushing this, or is it like a hydra and it's everywhere? Where can a pressure be applied?
The central head is the Federal Department of Education and its connection to the United Nations. Overwhelmingly, the United Nations and the Federal Department of Education are the kind of key organizational pressure points. How do you apply pressure to them? You have to convince your state to bite an ugly bullet. We're not taking their money anymore. Because when you stop taking the money, the strings go away. Actually, you're going to find out they're going to find other ways for the strings. But it puts them in a bad place. That's how they got you, as it turns out. So that's a primary place. Of course, the teachers' unions and helping people understand that the teachers' unions are not operating in the best interest of children. They're not even operating in the best interest of teachers as teachers. They're operating in the best interest of teachers as operatives who act in a professional way that suits the teachers' union. So working there, that's another pressure point. A lot of people don't realize that's also connected to the United Nations and an international teachers' union called Education International. A lot of this is that way. But that's going to be the major thing that's very difficult to press on directly. I understand you have one representative and all this. But the Federal Department of Education and its kind of very dirty, string-laden money is how a lot of this is occurring. But it also is required that more locally that people at either the local and or state level understand the issues, and in particular things like social emotional learning and how those things are being used to A, push these things or facilitate these things, but B, also to draw that federal money in the first place. Turns out that there's some really crafty, shady stuff that they've done in order to do that. For example, redefining at-risk for at-risk student. Of course, people think at-risk students should have more money given to them. There's all these programs set up for at-risk students to help them out, and we all think, well, that's good because, somebody can help out and better the school or the state than nobody. But it turns out that they, under COVID auspices, but also under social emotional learning auspices themselves, they redefined at risk. Everybody's at risk because of COVID and learning loss, et cetera, but every student in many of the states, I don't know if it's North Dakota, but it's 40-something of them now, and I think Utah was the first one to adopt it, so it's not like red states are immune from this. Redefined at risk as being at risk of graduating from high school not socially and emotionally competent, which means they're not college and career ready under the new definitions of college and career readiness that they wrote. Thus justifying at-risk money from, say, ESSER funds or CARES funds to dump into the state for the sole and express purpose of building social emotional learning programs. So a lot of the money that's coming from the federal government is coming specifically to build those things. If your legislators and your governor and so on, and I understand, don't know these things, they can't do anything about it. If they don't know anything about it also, more like if you think, oh, our governor sucks. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I don't know your governor. He doesn't do his pronouns as far as I know, like Spencer Cox in Utah. But if he doesn't know it, then he can't fight it. If he does know it and he doesn't fight it, then you know who you're dealing with, which is also great. And we're finding out a lot of people like Spencer Cox, he, him, and Brad Little in Idaho north of him and we could name lots of governors that have some serious deficiencies going on right now on the Republican side. You don't know it until they are unambiguously informed on the issue and then screw it up. Kevin Stitt in Oklahoma. That one's controversial, but I'll say it. These are the important things that you have to do. What you'll find is if you press on the schools or if you press on the administrators, I think that's important, but what you'll find is that at the end of the day, you're going to find that they're under pressures from on high that are much more powerful than they know what to do with, and they stress out, and you're probably the thing that's going to get kicked out of the machine when they stress out. This is particularly the key at universities, for example, like this, I'm sure, fine institution. If you went to the college president here and said, what are you doing? What's this DEI? Why are you forcing this? What's going on? You're going to find, first of all, a bunch of political speech, but if you were to cut through that political speech, and I know this because I've talked to a handful of college presidents now, you're going to find out that they have massive pressures with regard to financing, with regard to mortgage interest rates, with regard to pension funds, with regard to all this higher stuff that has them committed to where they don't know what to do except to kick you out and try to make you happy and go away. So the pressure points have to be kind of concentrated, in a very purposed fashion, but they also have to be strategic. Like, we've got a bigger thumb. You're under their control too. You're against them. They're causing your life to be miserable. I'm against them. Let's work together to try to figure out how to get this bad system fixed, and then finding the right people to do it. But frankly, this is coming from the top. The head is the head. And if we have no states willing to risk losing that federal money and getting back to basics, basic education, by the way, is not super expensive. It doesn't require a Chromebook to do basic education that can track your kid's eye movement. That can have a digital friend installed, which is an AI program that becomes anybody seen Harry Potter? And you know that diary that Ginny Weasley confesses all of her secrets to, and it's actually Lord Voldemort, and he captures her soul? They're creating digital AI friends that your kids can have online, that their chat buddy is actually an AI owned by Microsoft or Apple or Google or Amazon or whoever, whatever company, or the Trevor Project, which I keep getting in trouble for calling the Groomer Project. These chat buddies that they confess all their sins, all their fears, all their hopes, all their dreams that they talk to. Their best friend is a corporate-run AI data gathering scheme. None of that's actually necessary for education. Turns out people went to the moon by learning how to do math on blackboards. You needed chalk and a piece of slate and a teacher who knew math and didn't divert it into some political discussion by talking about amusement parks. So figuring out and getting the courage to say that we don't need that money, I think, is the key messaging. And see what happens when you try to get away from the money. Watch how they freak out.
Question over here. My mind is going all over the place in different rabbit holes here, but we came from Bismarck, north of here, against 40 to 60 mile an hour winds. Against them, and on the way back, we're going to have the wind at our back, because this is what's happening. I'm getting red-pilled, I guess I should say, about the education side of things. The day after elections, I quit substitute teaching and decided to pray. And by God, we better pray. If you know Jesus is your Savior, you better get on your knees and start begging Him for help. I mean, yelling and asking for help. You don't have to beg. I have a question for the history teacher. I think I'm being led towards this way. Mike Huckabee has a Constitution curriculum for children, teaching children. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I've heard a little bit about it. Not super familiar with it, but I know it exists. And
I'd like to get the best, information to start studying that. Right now I'm reading Alex Newman. There's another author of his Crimes of the Educators. Yeah. And it's breaking my heart, because I think as a teacher I've done some of that stuff myself as a reading specialist, teaching whole word, and all that.
Sure. I mean, it's kind of, the unfortunate thing is, while your kids are going to public schools, you almost need like an at-home program to deprogram them.
Oh.
They're getting programmed, they're getting indoctrinated at school. So if they just come home and there's no discussion about what they're learning, if they're not receiving a challenge, it's just the accepted truth.
So, educating the parents then to do that at home?
Yeah, I think parents, that's one thing you can meaningfully do to like kind of challenge and push back against it, is start asking your kids questions, going through making them skeptics. Okay. And kids, especially teenagers, have a rebellious side to them, so they might kind of like that. Like, hey, ask your teacher this, ask them this question, challenge back, nurture that rebellion against what they're being taught in school.
Oh, I like that. Well, I think I'm going to go away from this. I want to find out more about the Liberty Ladies, because that's women. When we get together, we can do a lot of stuff. So I'm thinking, when I go back to Bismarck, I want to kind of research that, and then getting these books and looking at that Constitution for kids, probably getting ready to teach that. I propose, in the name of Jesus, a mass exodus out of the schools now. I mean, it's coming. It's going to have to happen. So I think that's what we need to do. Think about a mass exodus for a moment to get this thing straightened out.
I don't think that's the
Okay, we've got a question right over here.
Hi, this is more of a comment to add to the information of the situation. I actually used to work at Minot Public Library. I worked there for about a year and a half, and I was extremely surprised at the amount of teen queer books that I saw while I was working there. I enjoy reading, so every weekend that I worked, I would get new books to read. 4 out of the 5 books that I would get each week, there was multiple queer characters in the book. You could not go any book without seeing so many allegations to all of the good things that are being proposed, and all of the things that you were talking about, all of the ways that they were trying to show kids that parents are bad, the culture is bad, all of the things that religion is teaching you is bad. So imagine my surprise when I saw the books that were being bought by the library for toddlers, 2- and 3-year-olds, that parents were giving their children to read about trans kids, picture books about lesbian parents, gay parents, all of these things that are so detrimental to children. And we think that in our red state, in our beautiful town of Minot, that our toddlers, our babies, are not being taught this stuff. If you go to the Minot Public Library, if you get books out for your children, ask the people who work there, why are you buying these books? What are you trying to do? There are so many sexually explicit books for children now, and I think that we need to start stopping those. We need to start taking account for our own children, but also, like you said, we need to stop the people who are in power, who are abusing that power and teaching our children. And myself, I'm 18, I'm a senior in high school. We need to stop them from not allowing the parents to see what our kids and my fellow peers are being taught.
Yeah, that's another pressure point, by the way. Getting the city council worked up about this and maybe defunding the library until they decide to see the light might shake some things up. That would be a kind of fun experiment. But I will tell you that the reason that this is happening is because professional organizations that have kind of monopoly power over how different institutions work are very, very heavily, very strongly corrupted. Whether it's 2 big ones, so you asked about pressure points. Anybody affiliated right now with the American Library Association or Librarians Association probably completely bought into this garbage. The professional organization has completely bought it. I was a mathematician. The American Mathematical Society has bought into this garbage. So librarian associations, start pressing on those. Start pressing on the affiliations. Is our library affiliated with that? Sever that affiliation. End that relationship. Another one, by the way, that's not something that's been brought up. It's not about libraries. It's not about schools. The American Academy of Pediatrics is a completely corrupt organization that's pushing this stuff. The gender, queer, trans, etc. stuff extremely hard. Don't take your children to a doctor affiliated with the AAP. Just look into these professional organizations and see how corrupt they are and start pressing on the relationships. Why are you related to these people when this organization says XYZ? And create that pressure at the level of the relationship to the professional organization and start asking questions of maybe we can do other professional organizations. Maybe we can do better without these professional organizations. And severing people from the propaganda and from, I can guarantee you almost with certainty that there's a catalog that the librarians are getting those books out of, and those are recommended books for the library being produced by some activist that's taken a hold of something like the American Library Association or something like that. And so pressing on those organizations and saying this organization is corrupt, our public library is beholden to a corrupt organization, so corrupt things are happening, makes an extremely clear chain of command and something actionable that can be done. Sever that relationship and start to see where some cards fall. And again, do these things and watch how upset people become. You will be very surprised. I call this the iron law of woke overreaction. And it always tells you when you've done something effective. I used to also call it the woke flip out test. If they flip out, you did something right. If they absolutely go bonkers, you've hit a target.
Okay, I'm going to close us, but I just want to, you have one question? Okay.
Moms for Liberty
Moms
privilege.
for Liberty, yes.
Yes, we are the only chapter of Moms for Liberty in North Dakota, so if anybody wants some information, we do have some handouts on the table out there. We would love to get more chapters here in North Dakota. Their goal is to get one in every county, so please, if you have any questions, I'll be out by the book table also. But I do want to address the America Library Association. So we in Williston have put forth many books for review. I found through my network of Moms for Liberty maybe a list that was a little bit bigger than I thought we were going to put out there. But interestingly enough, in our school district, the Bill of Rights for our library is directly from the America Library Association Bill of Rights, straight off their website. So there are third parties, and I took this to the school board, and I said there are third parties that are in charge of the books that are coming into our school systems. So we're not even really vetting the books, we're taking the recommendations and, great books that these kids want to read, and we just put them in our libraries with no questions asked. And so that was extremely concerning to me because we have no vetting process. And I don't expect a librarian to read hundreds of books that come in, but there has to be some sort of vetting process for sure. So anyway, that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. So if you have any questions for the Moms for Liberty, come find these ladies over here. I just want to thank our speakers. Again, let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. Please stop by the book table if you haven't already. Grab a brochure, ndcan.org. We have some resources on our website as well. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you, guys.
I think that's your water.
Yeah, we got to talk.